So I started these spaces so that people can access like audio recording of books, because I understand not everyone has the time and luxury and even the access to read books, the paperback. So that's what this space is for. So anyone can access these recordings anytime or any place whenever they have time. So the book I'm going to read today is probably maybe going to be an hour space. So wherever I end up, I'll make sure to keep note and just create another space until the book is complete. So the book I'm reading is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. On chapter 1, it says, if San Francisco, then everywhere. We think of the San Francisco Bay Area as one of the nation's more liberal. Oh, real quick, let me approve Miss Crid. Hey, Miss Crid. I'm going to be reading, so can I give you like co-host? Just in case like anyone else wants a mic, because I'm not going to be paying attention. Let me see. So, Miss Cray, I tried to give you a mic. I don't know if it's allowing you to get one. Oh, there we go, co-host. So yeah, I'll just repeat that. Basically, what this space is so that people can access like audio readings of the books that are in the Pan-African Library that's linked on the page. So it's just going to be me reading just straight from the book, and I'm probably going to do it for about an hour. And I'll make sure to like document each chapter for each space until the book is complete. That way anyone can just access it whenever they have time. So the book I'm reading is The Color of Law. And I'm just starting from chapter 1. So in San Francisco, then everywhere. We think of the San Francisco Bay Area as one of the nation's more liberal and inclusive regions. If the federal, state, and local governments explicitly segregated the population into distinct Black and white neighborhoods in the Bay Area, it's a reasonable assumption that our government also segregated metropolitan regions elsewhere, and with at least as much discrimination, which is why I became particularly interested in the government's racial policies in San Francisco and its environments in the 20th century. Across the bay from the city itself is Richmond, a town with the region's greatest concentration of African Americans. During World War II, Richmond hosted the most extensive shipbuilding complex in the nation. Later, it was best known as the site of a large oil refinery. There, I met Frank Stevenson in 2013 after reading an oral history that he had recorded for the National Park Service. I called on him at his Richmond home. One of the 7 brothers, Mr. Stevenson, was born in 1924 in Lake Providence, Louisiana, a town that Time magazine once called the poorest place in America. But he was privileged compared to most other Black youths in the South at the time. His father, a pastor, owned the land on which his First Baptist Church sat, so unlike many other Southern Black men in the early 20th century, he didn't have to sharecrop for white farmers. The Stevensons grew cotton and corn for sale and raised hogs and fowls, hunted, and maintained a vegetable garden for their own sustenance. Through the 7th grade, Frank attended a one-room schoolhouse in his father's church with a single teacher who lived with the family. If Frank were to continue, he would have had to get to a high school in town too far to walk. In rural Louisiana in the early 1930s, the school year for African Americans was much shorter than for whites, because children like Frank were expected to hire out when planting or harvesting was to be done. Actually, Mr. Stevenson recalled, they didn't care too much whether you were going to school or not. If you were Black, white school would be continued, but they would turn the Black school out because they wanted the kids to go to work on the farm. Lots of times these white guys would come to my dad and ask him to let us work for them 1 or 2 days of the week. During this time, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, first with industry codes and then with the Fair Labor Standards Act, prohibited child labor and established a minimum wage of about $12 a week in the South, rising to 25 cents an hour in 1938. But to pass such economic legislation, Roosevelt needed the votes of Southern congressmen and senators who agreed to support economic reform only if it excluded industries in which African Americans predominated, like agriculture. The Stevenson brothers were each paid only 50 cents a day to work in white fields. I just wanted to pause right there to note how important that paragraph was. It shows how systemic, racism and white supremacy works. In order for the president to pass a deal to get certain people to vote for him, everyday working class people to vote for him, he had to promise the bourgeois class that he would leave out industries so that black people would not benefit from legislation being passed. That's shit that we're talking about on how this is systemic and how we got here today. But I'll try not to stop reading too much because shit, I can go on and on about this. So I'm gonna just continue. If anyone's new, all I'm doing is just reading literally word for word this book called Color of Law. I'm doing it so that people who don't have time to read the physical copy can access the audio. So it's not going to be a discussion. It's more so just me reading. So just a heads up. Okay. After finishing 7th grade, Frank Stevenson followed his older brothers and found work in New Orleans, delivering food to workers in the shipyards. Later, he had jobs that were typically reserved for African Americans, carrying cement, laying rails, and loading or unloading freight, including once World War II began, dangerous ammunition. He followed his brother Alan to California, eventually settling at the age of 19 in Richmond. At first, the shipyards and other war industries attempted to operate only with white men, but as the war dragged on, unable to find a sufficient number to meet their military orders, they were forced to hire white women, then black men, and eventually black women as well. From 1940 to 1945, the influx of war workers resulted in Richmond's population exploding from 24,000 to more than 100,000. Richmond's black population soared from 270 to 14,000. Like Frank Stevenson, the typical African-American settling in Richmond had a 7th grade education, which made these migrants an elite. Their educational attainment was greater than that of African Americans in the southern states they had left behind. With such rapid population growth, housing could not be put up quickly enough. The federal government stepped in with public housing. It was officially and explicitly segregated. Located along the railroad tracks and close to the shipping buildings area, federally financed housing for African Americans in Richmond was poorly constructed and intended to be temporary. For white defense workers, government housing was built farther inland, closer to the white residential areas, and some of it was sturdily constructed and permanent. Because Richmond had been overwhelmingly white before the war, the federal government's decision to segregate public housing established segregated living patterns that persist to this day. The Richmond Police, as well as the Housing Authority, pressed the city's recreation department to forbid integrated activities, so where projects for whites and projects for blacks shared recreational and sports facilities, the authority designated special hours for African American use. Man, I'm so sorry, y'all, but I have to highlight this part because oftentimes when we hear about white supremacy and how it works, and yes, we rightfully, point out it's institutional and the roles of that of the bourgeois. But this book does a really good job to show you that across class lines, crackers united to make sure black people were held down, and not just in words, but through literal legislation on the books. It's just wild when you read about it. So the Richmond Police, as well as the Housing Authority, pressed the city's recreation department to forbid integration activities. So where projects for whites and projects for blacks shared recreational and sports facilities, the authorities designated special hours for African American use. The authority maintained separate social programs for whites and blacks, Boys and Girl Scout troops, and movie screenings. For example, a policy of segregation was adopted, explaining the authority's director for the purpose of keeping social harmony or balance in the whole community. So basically, they said that the reason why they needed segregation to keep white and black people apart was for social harmony and balance in the whole community. Yo, sorry, I'll keep going. It's just, damn, it's a lot. Another housing authority official insisted that Negroes from the South would rather be by themselves. And again, so segregation, right? is oftentimes misrepresented in our current times. They make it seem like it was just black people lived on one side and white people lived on another. Yes, that's what it was like aesthetically, but what also was is that the black people got the dirtiest water, the worst plumbing, that you can go and rob black people if you want. Any crime you wanted to commit and you didn't want to go to jail for, all you had to do is go to the black side. So they constantly being terrorized by crackers. Women couldn't walk outside getting raped. We're talking about living in torture, while the cracker side is like Mayberry. So that's what segregate. And in order to keep it Mayberry, they also, again, as they described here, their children still had to work. And they even shut down their schools sooner so that their kids could be available to work. So you're talking about everyone working from like the age of fucking 10. You know, the housing is made shitty, like they just described. And the city said they made it that way because they wanted it to be temporary, because they did not want to keep black people in these cities. So then how do you get them out? You jail or by killing them and or allowing like legal terror. This is the kind of dots you got to connect when you read about your history and what our people not only endured, but overcame. Those crackers are fucking crazy. But anyways, I apologize. I'll keep reading. 20 projects with 24,000 units for both races built in Richmond during this period barely met the need for white workers. The federal government created a war guest program in which at least spare rooms from Richmond's white families so workers could move in as tenants. The government also issued low-interest loans for white homeowners to remodel and subdivide their residences. Consistent with this policy, the federal government recruited one of the nation's leading mass production developers, David Bowman, to create Rollingwood, a new Richmond suburb. Federal officials approved bank loans to finance construction, requiring that none of the Rollingwood 700 houses can be sold to African Americans. So just in case I didn't read that, clear enough, the federal officials approved bank loans to finance construction, requiring that none of the rolling 700s can be sold to African Americans. So it's like, they told contractors, we'll give you this government contract as long as you do make sure you do not build houses for niggas, like literally. And this is how this works. So when they try to describe as racism like an accident or like some youthful mistake, no, remember that it's very deliberate. And it takes action. And in order for us to be living under a system of white supremacy today, everyone has to play their role. And that's what this describes. And that's what systemic means. So, although African Americans with fewer private options were more dependent on public housing than whites, the Richmond Housing Authority segregated projects did less to alleviate the housing shortage for African Americans than for white families. Not surprisingly, units for African Americans included many doubled-up families and illegal sublets. By 1947, when Richmond's black population had increased to 26,000, half still lived in temporary war housing. As the government financed whites to abandon these apartments for permanent homes in the suburbs like Rollingwood, vacancies in white projects were made available to African Americans. Gradually, black families became almost the only tenants of Richmond's public housing, except for the 3 permanent projects of the sturdily constructed units that had been assigned to whites, most of whom didn't want to leave. By 1950, the city's ghetto had expanded with more than 3/4 of Richmond's black population living in war projects. For black workers like Frank Stevenson, who couldn't squeeze into the limited number of public housing units, there was no war guest or other supplemental government programs. For Stevenson, like many African Americans in Richmond who did not get into the segregated public projects, lived in North Richmond, an unincorporated area for which the city provided no services. I'll explain what unincorporated means. Actually, here in Texas, San Branch, Texas, is an unincorporated town right outside of Dallas. And what it means is like they don't get like utilities, like water. Everything is just, they don't get anything from the city. Now, the downside for San Branch is that they haven't had clean water in over 80 years. And because they're unincorporated, the city refuses to like create a pipeline so that they can get fresh water, which is only like 5 miles away. So this is where he lived. He lived in an unincorporated town. So just think of back then the very little resources that black people had. He lived in an area where you had even less than that. So he boarded with an elderly woman with whom he traded maintenance for rent. Other black war workers in North Richmond not as fortunate as Frank Stevenson, remained in cardboard shacks, barns, tents, or even open fields. Black workers who earned steady wages at war industries could save to buy small plots in unincorporated North Richmond. But because the federal government refused to insure bank loans made to African Americans for housing, standard construction was unaffordable. Some built their own dwellings with orange crates or scrap lumber scoured from the shipyards. By the early 1950s, some 4,000 African Americans in North Richmond were still living in these makeshift homes. During the war, the government also collaborated with private groups to segregate Richmond. The United Service Organization, USO, maintained separate black and white clubs in Richmond for military personnel and also operated separate black and white travelers' aid services for newly arrived war workers. On one occasion in 1943, the USO proposed a service center for African Americans on property that was available in a white neighborhood. The local newspaper, the Richmond Independent, protested. A petition drive in opposition to the plan ensued, and the city council prevented the plan from going forward. Although the USO was and is a private organization, it was organized by President Roosevelt, who held the title of honorary chairman, benefited from the use of government buildings for some of his clubs, coordinated services with the War Department, and had a congressional charter. Along with the city's council's action, this tight federal government nexus rendered the USO's practice of segregation in Richmond and elsewhere an aspect of de jure segregation. Let me see what time it is. Okay. To ensure no African Americans migrated to Richmond unless they were essential to the war effort, the city's police stopped African American men on the street and then arrested and jailed them if they couldn't prove they were employed. So after joining his other brother Alan in Richmond, Frank Stevenson quickly located a job at a Ford Motor Assembly plant that had been taken over by the government for the manufacture of military jeeps and the refurbishing of damaged tanks. In the 1930s, the Ford plant had a sign in front, "No Mexican or Black workers wanted." But when Frank Stevenson arrived in 1944, his services were badly needed. 3 years earlier, the United Auto Workers had forced Henry Ford to the bargaining table, and at the war's end, a union contract prevented Ford Motor from firing African Americans to make way for returning white veterans or for white workers who had been laid off from military production in places like the shipyards. So in 1945, when the Army gave up control of the plant and the Ford Motor Company began to make cars again, Black workers who had been hired during the war were able to stay on with secure industrial jobs. Ford had established the plant in 1931 after Richmond offered the company. Oh, so let me say real quick, y'all. So this is a real chill, boring space where I'm just reading this book out loud for people who might not have time or access to the hard copy. So that's all it is. I know I keep stopping and talking, but so if you have a request and it hasn't been, acknowledged, that's why. We're just reading. And it's only going to last until 10. So where was I? When they were first hired during the war, Black workers were assigned only to the lowest, most strenuous job classifications. But the union fought to open more skilled assignments to African Americans. Frank Stevenson seems to have been among the most ambitious and talented, and within a decade of being employed, he was sufficiently skilled to fill in when workers at different workstations were at lunch. "I was smart enough," Mr. Stevenson said, "to go to other jobs on my break and say, 'Let me see what you do.' That's why they made me a utility man." In the 1950s, as the post-war consumer boom created growing demand for automobiles, Ford's Richmond plant had no room to expand. Highways made undeveloped rural areas accessible, and land was cheap, allowing Ford the opportunity to spread out and eliminate the insufficiency of multi-story buildings. So in 1953, the company announced it would close its Richmond plant and reestablish operations in a larger facility 50 miles south in I'm probably going to say that name wrong, Milpitas? Whatever, a suburb of San Jose, rural at the time. And we're just going to call that Town M because I don't know how to say that word. So Town M is part of what we now call Silicon Valley. Ford purchased a 160-acre site from the Western Pacific Railroad, which had bought 1,700 acres in hopes of attracting industrial facilities for a rail hub. Union leaders met with Ford executives and negotiated an agreement permitting all 1,400 Richmond plant workers, including the approximately 250 African Americans, to transfer to new facility. Once Ford's plans became known, Town M residents incorporated the town and passed an emergency ordinance permitting the newly installed city council to ban apartment construction and allow only single-family homes. Developers then set to work creating subdivisions of inexpensive single-family houses for workers not only at Ford but at the other plants that Western Pacific had drawn to that area. So what this is basically describing is how the way the towns are laid out was literally laid out in a way because of racism, like literally a racist strategy. Like the reason why black towns are located in one place or white towns or white houses are in one place, it's not by accident. It's clearly all by design. And this book does such a good job of literally walking you through it and how it actually happened. So it's not conspiracy, it's actually history. Okay, so let's see. The builders went to the Federal Housing Administration for approval of their subdivision plans and then used these approvals to get banks to issue low-interest loans to finance construction. If the houses conformed to specifications, the federal government then guaranteed mortgages to qualified buyers without a further property appraisal. Although banks would generally make mortgage loans to affluent buyers without government involvement, they usually shied away from making loans to working class families unless the mortgages were insured. With reduced risk, banks offered lower interest rates, making ownership more affordable to working class families. For veterans, government approval also usually meant that no down payment was no down payment was required. As in the Rolling Wood 10 years earlier, one of the federal government's specifications for mortgages insured in M-Town was an openly stated prohibition on all sales to African Americans. So basically what I just described is how from the construction to the permitting to the city council rulings, all worked in tandem to maintain a white society in white towns that are still intact today, but not just so that they can have white towns, so that they can have white towns and that specifically black people would be kept in these horrible conditions so that they can be exploited for their labor. So again, this book is so important because I know this world living in capitalism have you think you're going crazy and that I must be a conspiracy theorist, but honestly the truth is so much stranger than fiction. So again, I'm reading The Color of Law for anyone new in here. We're not really doing speakers. I'm just reading it so that people who don't have time to read the physical copy can just tap into this recorded space whenever they feel like it and be able to access this book. So yeah. All right. Because M-Town had no apartments and houses in the area were off limits to black workers, though their incomes and economic circumstances were like those of whites on the assembly line, African Americans at Ford had to choose between giving up their good industrial jobs, moving to apartments in a segregated neighborhood of San Jose, or enduring lengthy commutes between North Richmond and M-Town. Frank Stevenson bought a van, recruited 8 others to share the cost, and made the drive daily for the next 20 years until he retired. The trip took more than an hour each way. Of Frank Stevenson and his 8 carpoolers, only one was ever able to move farther south, closer to the plant, and he was not able to do so until the late 1960s. He found a home in Haywood, a town about halfway between Richmond and M-Town that had also previously been closed to African Americans. As the civilian house shortages eased after the war and more government-subsidized suburbs like Rolling Wood were built for white working-class families, Richmond itself became a predominantly black city. As the black population of North Richmond swelled, African Americans began to break into the South Richmond housing market. Soon, South Richmond as well became part of Richmond's ghetto. In 1970, after his daughters finished high school, Frank Stevenson was finally able to buy his first home in the southern, previously whites-only section of the city. Real quick. So when they describe it became the ghetto, because in modern times we use the word way differently, what they're describing is think of just an area in which you let people go into the houses, but in order to maintain houses, you have to be able to access like supplies. You have to be able to be given permits and approvals to build and maintain your home, all of this shit. And you're going to have to get in contact with maybe a plumber and all these people to help you maintain your house. Well, all these people have contracts with the city that tells them you cannot help anybody black at all. And that's how you'll be able to get your government contract renewed. So you're talking about black people unable to maintain the house. What happens? Well, the house is going to crumble. It's going to get mold. Shit's going to break, and that can't get fixed because you're kept out from fixing it. So then that's how your neighborhood slowly deteriorates. And then people blame the people instead of looking at the systemic things that were put in place to make that happen each and every time. So now we've been conditioned that when we roll by these type of towns, we're like, oh, the people just don't know how to keep it up. And in reality, they actually are victims of being targeted by a very sadistic omnicidal system in which it's put on paper like this is literally how and why they do it. Again, not conspiracy, history. Let's see. Okay, so as the civilian housing shortage eased after the war and more government-subsidized suburbs like Rollingwood were built for white working-class families, Richmond itself became a predominantly black city. As the black population of Richmond swelled, African Americans began to break into the South Richmond housing market. Soon South Richmond as well became a part of Richmond's ghetto. In 1970, after his daughters finished high school, Frank Stevenson was finally able to buy his first home in the southern, previously whites-only section of the city. At the end of the World War II, Stanford University in Palo Alto, south of San Francisco, recruited Wallace Stenger, to teach creative writing. Yo, Palo Alto is like Shaw's favorite thing to talk about. Shout out to him. Stanford's offer followed the publication in 1943 of Stegner's widely acclaimed semi-autobiographical novel. I said that word so loud. Wait, semi-autobiographical. There we go. Tried. Novel, The Big Rock Candy Mountain. Years later, Stegner will go on to win Pulitzer Prize, the Pulitzer Prize, and the National Book Award. But when he arrived in Palo Alto with his family immediately after the war, his financial resources were modest. Like the rest of the country, the Stanford area was suffering from a housing shortage. During the war, with all available material and labor reserved for military use, the government had prohibited civilian housing construction, except for projects designed for the defense industry in towns like Richmond. Stegner joined and then helped to lead a cooperative of middle and working class families who were all unable to find available housing. For the most part, college professors were not highly paid. The co-op included others of similar economic status: public school teachers, city employees, carpenters, nurses. Of the first 150 families to join, 3 were African American. All right. This is so fucking important because so far when this book would bring up ways and through legislation they would, discriminate against our people, against black people. The book does a good job of following up of the way in which black people strategized to make things happen anyways, despite being oppressed. And oftentimes, if you study these ways in which they use, they're oftentimes socialists. And I have to point that out because unfortunately, especially here in the West, we have been indoctrinated to see all things starting off as white, and that's including socialism and communism. When in actuality, if you knew black history, socialism and communism was always there, even before Marx. Marx just observed it. He didn't create it. Just had to put that in there. Oh, a contradiction. What's up? So what I'm doing is I'm just doing a really boring space where I'm just reading a book out loud. I keep going off though, because every time I get to a part, I'm like, yo, these fucking crackers. But yeah, that's all it is. Just for people who can't access the physical copy, they can just tune into this recorded space and get the book for free. So let me finish. Let me see. All right. Got another 30 minutes. Calling itself the Peninsula. There you go. Calling itself the Peninsula Housing Association of Palo Alto. The co-op purchased 260-acre ranch adjacent to the Stanford campus, planned to build 400 houses as well as shared recreational facilities, a shopping area, a gas station, a restaurant on commonly owned land. but banks would not finance construction costs nor issue mortgages to the co-op or its members without government approval, and the FHA would not insure loans to the cooperative that included African American members. The cooperative's board of directors, including Stegner, recommended against complying with the demand that the cooperative reconstitute itself as an all-white organization. But the membership, attempting to appease the government, voted in January 1948 by a narrow 78 to 75 margin to compromise. The co-op proposed to include a quota system in its bylaws and deeds, promising that the proportion of African Americans in the Peninsula Housing Association would not exceed the portion of African Americans in California's overall population. That's fucking important because a lot of times, especially in leftist circles, we are afraid to talk about history in very real terms. That yes, there have been many a times in which the white working class has betrayed the black working class to secure their position in their class status. It has happened many a times, but no one wants to talk about it because we oftentimes want to paint the past and, we all just got along because we all, we're in the same class position or all exploited. No, that's not the case. Oftentimes other oppressed people will oppress people. So if we're gonna understand that, we're gonna have to also know the history of, what really happened between the working classes as far as black and white. And no, that shit wasn't all we're coming together, kumbaya shit. And why, because of this betrayal, repeatedly them betraying the fucking movements and, the working class interests, we literally find ourselves where we are today, and we're wondering why. Y'all gonna have me go the fuck off. I'm start preaching, but it's important because if we really want to see liberation and freedom, these are some of the histories and the present we're gonna have to wrestle with, and we're gonna have to come to an understanding and create a sustainable strategy to where we finally break this fucking system, so it doesn't incentivize this behavior. So it goes, this concession did not appease government officials and the project stalled. Stegner, they sold out and they still got their project stalled. That's fucking crazy. But that's what happens. Like you'll have the white working class betray the black working class for a leg up, and then it ended up getting knocked back further down. It's like stop believing the state and stop portraying like even your own class interests. Man, I better see revolution in my lifetime. I swear to God. So, it says, obtain financing without government approval. In 1950, the association sold its land to a private developer whose FHA agreement specified that no properties to be sold by African Americans. The builder then constructed individual homes for sale to whites in Ladera, a subdivision that still adjoins to Stanford campus today. Over the next few years, the number of African Americans seeking jobs and homes in the near Palo Alto grew, but no developer who depended on federal government loan insurance would sell to them, and no California state licensed real estate agent would show them houses. But then in 1954, one resident of a whites-only area in East Palo Alto, across a highway from the Stanford campus, sold his house to a black family. Almost immediately, Floyd Lowe, president of the California Real Estate Association, set up an office in East Palo Alto to panic white families into listing their homes for sale, a practice known as blockbusting. He and other agents warned that a Negro invasion was imminent and that it would result in collapsing property values. Soon, growing numbers of white owners succumbed to the scaremongering and sold it at discounted prices to the agents and their speculators. The agents, including Lowe himself, then designed display ads with banner headlines, "Colored Buyers," with exclamation point, which they ran in San Francisco newspapers. African Americans desperate for housing purchased the homes at inflated prices. Within a 3-month period, one agent alone sold 60 previously white-owned properties to African Americans. Again, y'all, at inflated rates. Oh my God. That's enough. Let me stop interrupting. My bad. The California Real Estate Commissioner refused to take any action, asserting that while regulations prohibited licensed agents from engaging in unethical practices, the exploitation of racial fear was not within the Real Estate Commission's jurisdiction. Although the local real estate board would ordinarily blackball any agent who sold to a non-white buyer in the city's white neighborhood, thereby denying the agent access to multiple listing services upon which his or her business depended. Once wholesale blockbusting began, the board was unconcerned, even supportive. At the time, the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration not only refused to insure mortgages for African Americans in designated white neighborhoods like Ladara, they also would not insure mortgages for whites in a neighborhood where African Americans were present. So once East Palo Alto was integrated, whites wanting to move into the area could no longer obtain government-insured mortgages. State-regulated insurance companies like the Equitable Life Insurance Company and the Prudential Life Insurance Company, I know I said that wrong, y'all. I'm sorry, also declared that their policy was not to issue mortgages to whites in integrated neighborhoods. State insurance. So what that's describing real quick is just how even after integration was made into law, locally and statewide and in common practice in all like different markets, still made sure to practice white supremacy. So they still felt the effects of integration. I'm sorry, of segregation. And even today, we are still segregated. But because I guess we see enough images on TV of an illusion that we think like we're not in an open air prison, but we are. Again, I encourage y'all to get this book. Let's see. Okay. Okay. Within 6 years, the population of East Palo Alto was 82% Black. Conditions deteriorated as African Americans who had been excluded from other neighborhoods doubled up in single-family homes. The East Palo Alto houses had been priced so much higher than similar properties for whites that the owners had difficulty making payments without additional rental income. Federal and state housing policy had created a slum in East Palo Alto. With the increased density of the area, the school district could no longer accommodate all Palo Alto students. So in 1958, it proposed to create a second high school to accommodate the expanding student population. The district decided to construct the new school in the heart of what had became East Palo Alto Ghetto. So Black students in Palo Alto's existing integrated building would have to withdraw, creating a segregated African American school in the east section and a white one to the west. The board ignored pleas of African American and liberal white activists that it draw on east-west school boundary to establish two integrated secondary schools. In ways like these, federal, state, and local governments purposely created segregation in every metropolitan area of the nation. If it could happen in liberal San Francisco, then indeed it not only could, but did happen everywhere. That the San Francisco region was segregated by government policy and particularly striking because, in contrast to metropolitan areas like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, or Baltimore, North California had few African Americans before migrants like Frank Stevenson arrived during World War II in search of jobs. The government was not following pre-existing racial patterns. It was imposing segregation when it hadn't previously taken root. Yo, that's the end of chapter 1. So I'll make another space probably tomorrow and finish it. But yeah, I'm good. I'm probably going to close down the space.